Thank you, everybody, for coming to see this presentation. I'll get right to it. So the major question that I'm trying to address, and that's been my interest for several years, even before I decided to do a PhD in urban climatology, is how do we integrate climate data, climate information, climate knowledge into decision making, particularly planning. As I started to read, I started to see that there wasn't a lot of consensus between these two fields on how to address this issue. Urban climatology saw this mainly as a communication issue. We have a knowledge gap, we have an issue of transference. And they're seeing this problem as very dynamic, almost looking at this over time, very horizontally. Well, planning is seeing this issue as sort of a static part of a combination of layers and processes. And there's a need for synthesis, but there's not a lot of literature coming out of this group. So my hypothesis in looking at this was, well, there's a methodological problem here. They don't really talk the same language, basically, and that's why we're not being able to incorporate this into practice. Oops, skip. And as an icon student, the big picture, the framework that I'm using to address this problem is an integrative research approach. I want to demonstrate the nuanced, the plural and incommensurable aspects that are involved in this complex problem and face it from multiple directions, and start off by engaging with the community and understanding how do we do this together, what issue, how do we collaborate, understand multiple perspectives. Mixed methods approach and multiple theoretical frameworks are involved. So I've been working in the coast for a while, even in my master's, and so I went to Chatham County, which is the most populated county in the state of Georgia. It houses Savannah, the fifth biggest, most populated city in the state. And I started to do these preliminary meetings with members of different institutions in the county from July to November of 2017, and basically asking them, well, you're addressing climate from a sea level rise perspective, flooding perspective, water related perspectives. What other hazards could we address? And I had an incline towards heat, but I wanted to make sure that this was an issue that was pertinent to their reality and to their situation. And so they said, yeah, heat is a problem, and we need to address this as a heat response plan. We need to develop a heat response plan, and we need a communication strategy too. We need to know how to address this to the public. And the most interesting thing that came out of this was, what happens if a major power outage occurs and it's hot, right? We're talking about a place that has hurricanes pretty much every season, and so they were worried about what would happen if a big hurricane came over, power outage, and it was hot. And this is interesting. We're talking about 2017. Between the times I'm doing these preliminary meetings, before and right after, we're talking Hurricane Irma and Hurricane Maria. And that's exactly what happened in both of those situations. And so they were right on spot to be worried about this issue. Now, one thing that a lot of people are not aware of is that heat is the deadliest weather-related hazard in the United States. It is responsible for over a fifth of all weather-related deaths since 1986. It does kill more than hurricanes, even though we don't know that or don't see it as much. And studies in heat vulnerability have indicated that risk is directly related to urbanization, urban land cover, and there's a tendency that's going to increase with climate change. And not all populations are vulnerable to this. Not everybody is equally vulnerable to this issue, okay? So in the case of Chatham County, what we're looking at is an 11.7% elderly population, over 65 years of age. 7.1% under the age of 5. This is two age groups that are particularly vulnerable to heat. We're talking about 25.4% low-income population. And that is census data, so it's not accounting for the homeless population, which according to the Homeless Authority isn't 4,500 or so. And very importantly, we're talking about Savannah. This is a very big tourist attraction in the state, and it attracts people from all over the country. That fluctuating 13.9 million people a year, some of these people are not accustomed to the high temperatures that you're going to see in this region. And so they are also vulnerable, and we need to be aware of them. Now, another interesting tidbit is this population, the over 65, according to the Savannah Metropolitan Commission and their projections, it is seen to rise by 70.6%, meaning by 2030, we're going to have about 20% of the population being over 65. So we're increasing the number of people that are potentially vulnerable in the county over the time. So this is a quick overview of what we're going to go over here in the next slides. A heat respond plan workshop is kind of the core of what I did, but it starts off from the heat vulnerability mapping and developing the data and understanding, okay, I know what the problem is, and so we're going to look in chapter 2 at all the data that was developed and how we evolved and the analysis that was done. Then we're going to look at the results of the actual workshop and how that occurred and how they used the data that was produced, and if it was assimilated. And then finally, we're going to look at the thought processes. What went on in that room? What occurs when we're bringing in new information, and how does that change things? What are the processes that involved that could ensure that this data is being used? It's going to be applied. It's going to be incorporated. So let's get to it. Chapter 2, it looks to understand the long-term spatial and temporal relationships of the land cover changes and the land surface temperature variations. Now, this is a novel approach. I could only find actually one study that's done the similar approach to what you have here, and it's looking at previous studies in this area have focused in small time frames. And they found that vegetation abundance and impervious cover are consistently identified as the most important determinant of land surface temperature increases. But what we're trying to do is a more robust analysis, looking at a longer time period to try and understand the combined spatial and temporal aspects. And the hypothesis is that could indicate specific types of development or changes in land cover that are responsible for higher thermal impacts. I do 3 analyses in this chapter, in this section of my dissertation. First, I look at a land cover change analysis, looking at national land cover data sets from 1992, 2001, and 2011. And there's a slight difference between, we're basically looking at the codes that are embedded into those images. 1992 to 2001, there was a slight change in how they were coding, so we had to take that into consideration in the analysis. Land surface change, land surface temperature change analysis looked at Landsat surface reflectance Tier 1 images, band 6, which is the thermal band. And because of the time span that we're looking at, 1992, 2001, 2011, we're looking at 3 years prior to those analyses. So for 1992, the images that we're analyzing are in 1992, 91, 90. So we're looking at the 3 years before to start to understand how that land surface was behaving. And we do the same thing for 2001 and for 2011. So the P is the period ending in that number. And in both of these instances, I had the help of CGR, particularly Sergio, to implement Google Earth platform. And this is really the crux of why we were able to do this high time span, is we're using their server to do all the analysis for this data. And then finally, we extracted the data points from these images, and I did a linear regression model and applied a Tukey honest significance difference test post hoc to evaluate the response of the temperature slope to the changes of land cover. Basically, trying to identify if I'm right. Are there land cover changes that make a difference and end up making higher temperature changes? And in this case, I used a combination of ArcGIS, R, and the Tidyverse package. And here are the samples, number of samples, and formula we used. Okay, results. Land cover changes. So basically what we're looking at here is, as you're seeing this image, this is going from 92 to 2011, and as you see, as it gets redder, pinker, and you start losing a lot of the green area, that means that we're seeing more development occur, and it's occurring towards this kind of edge, but a little bit over here, so you can kind of start seeing the changes that have occurred over time. Basically what happened is the county lost about 10% of its tree canopy cover over this period of time. And it gained about 8.1% of impervious cover during that same time period. So what we're seeing is a lot of this change from tree canopy has actually gone to impervious cover. Second result, looking at that land surface temperature. We're looking at maximum brightness temperature here. And again, you can see that it's going to start getting redder and redder and redder. We're looking 92 through 2011. Highest temperatures, you can see 92 to 2001, 2011. We're going from 105.8 Fahrenheit to 120.2. And then average maximum brightness temperatures. There's an interesting occurrence here where we see 2001 with slightly higher temperature than 2011. And this is due in part because this 2001 period saw a couple of extreme weather heat events during the periods of August, and you can see that peak right here in this graphics where 2001 kind of gets a little hotter. Now both studied periods had heat and extreme heat events, but this one in 2001 actually broke a record. It's the second hottest day on record for the state, for the county, so 104. The other thing to keep in mind is we're looking at satellite images. So what also could have happened is as the satellite's flying, we could have an oversampling on one year versus the other. But it's important to know that and understand that there was some difference in the way that temperature was behaving during those two studied periods. And here's the analysis of this slope and understanding what has happened throughout this period in comparison. And basically what the slope and amplitude analysis has shown is that we've had an increase of 15 Celsius, approximately 27 Celsius. So there are surfaces here that have increased that much over this time period. So now we're going to look at the relationship between the land use, land covered analysis that we did and the land surface temperature analysis. And what you can see is consistently urban development tends to be at the temperatures that are higher. So what you're seeing is comparing 92, so this is maximum brightness temperature, this is then LCD classes, and up here you can see how they're kind of grouped together. So the vegetated, the forested areas tend to be, as you can see in all three cases, the lowest temperatures that we're seeing, and the developed areas are the highest ones in all three cases. So the analysis that we did, and particularly the use of the post hoc Tukey HSD test, enables us to understand how these are different from each other. So these little letters that you see on top of each of these analyses show how significant these changes are amongst each other. Meaning, this is an evergreen forest change to a high-intensity residential. And this is a wooded wetlands, meaning there's forest, there's trees in here changing to the same exact high residential intensity. The difference in temperature among each other is not significant. However, it is significant with any of these other changes that do not have an A on them. This tells us an important story. This means that the forested to urbanized change is the highest impact in temperature. The loss of tree canopy cover means a lot for this land surface temperature. Then the loss of vegetation. So it's not about any vegetation. Trees have a higher impact than other tribes of like shrubs, grasses and other things. Then it's the intensity of that urbanization. Meaning, are we cramping more stuff in there and getting it higher, more buildings, more impervious surface in that same location? And then it goes into low intensity and vegetated. And those changes are, if you look at them, most of them have M, so they're actually not significant among each other. So what are the conclusions of this particular chapter? It demonstrated that the increase in land surface temperature during these 20 years was linked to the loss of forested and wetland land cover types. The results confirmed the hypothesis that certain types of land uses actually do lead to higher land surface temperature changes over time. And they align with similar findings. Like I said, the only study that I've found that did apply to similar methodology is Fu and Wang 2016. And they did a study in Atlanta, and they actually found that evergreen forest has a higher impact when changed to high-intensity urbanized areas. So there's a connection there, and we're on the same line of conclusions. Oops. So we'll move on to chapter 3. This chapter is looking at the process, what was produced during the workshop, the heat vulnerability workshop, heat response planning workshop that was developed in Chatham County. It examines how heat vulnerability mapping can be applied at this sort of scale, at a county scale. And it is intended to inform land use planners and decision makers on urban climate interactions. The hypothesis here is that the application of heat vulnerability mapping can actually aid in visually depicting the social and environmental aspects of urban climatology. And this is trying to use a method that's adaptable to the way that land use planners go about making decisions. There's a combination of 3 frameworks here. We're combining heat vulnerability, co-production, and geodesign. These are 3 different lines of thought. The heat vulnerability is kind of at the core of what we're doing, and then co-production and geodesign are informing both how we're understanding the problem and how we're applying it. Co-production, the methods applied through the lens of co-production, is a rapid assessment process or a rapid qualitative analysis. So that's where the preliminary meetings came in. What is the issue? What types of data? So there was 9 meetings during that 2017 period, and then for the workshop, I directly worked in collaborations with the Coastal Regional Commission, the National Weather Service, and Chatham Emergency Management Agency to build a workshop during a 1.5 day from July 17th to July 18th, and with a focus group of 45 minutes at the very end. So we brought in the data, we worked together to apply it, we talked about the issue, we started off talking about the issue, and then we sat down and as a group said, okay, how do we do this? How do we go about this? So I was an observant participator in this process as well. And at the end, we discussed, okay, how does this work? What needs to be done? How do we do this? How does this become something that we can continue and move on with? Geodesign comes in through the actual systemic form of applying the process. And we use a web-based platform, which is also known as a planning support system, which is called Geodesign Hub. It means that in real time, everybody that was in the room had a computer, and as they were designing, as they were doing things, they could see what each of the other members of the groups were doing. So it was real-time collaboration, and everything that they were inputted was actually saved and recorded in this system, so that I could then explore a little bit more and do some analysis. They could actually put in notes. They explain in the system what they were trying to do, and so that was recorded. And this is an adaptation of a format proposed by Carl Steinitz. And there are many forms of addressing geodesign. I chose to kind of follow his line, but it is an adaptation. In Steinitz's process, you would have a multitude of disciplines in the room, and you would have people from the place. In this case, I was really focused on this interaction between climate and planning, and looking at how these two groups work together. So it's a smaller framework. And to do so, we use what is called evaluation maps, meaning that I had to bring in 8 maps to them so that they could move on from there. And the development of those maps was completely based on heat vulnerability studies. So what are the components? What are the things that they need to keep in mind when they're doing this workshop? And so based on studies in heat vulnerability, I came up with 8 maps that try to translate the things that they need to be aware of. And this is also a novel approach. When you're looking at studies in heat vulnerability, all these components are taken into consideration, but there's an index that comes out of it. There's a number, and you say, okay, this is a vulnerable location because this plus this plus this plus this has added up, and this is a 5, and this is the number. I'm simplifying it, but there's an output. In this situation, I'm giving them the components, and I'm opening it up for them to try and input their own context, understand what's going on, and try to come up with decisions. So they're taking it all into consideration, but I'm opening it up for them to put their knowledge into it. So we started off with green infrastructure, and I divided it in 2 for one particular reason. Savannah has a lot of green infrastructure embedded into the city. So I wanted them to be more aware of that, and so I highlighted that aspect of it so that they're looking at the smaller scale, not just focusing at the big scale. The environmental aspects, we're going back to where we started. Storm surge, hurricanes, these are the areas that are highly impacted by these hurricanes, and where these power outages are going to occur, where is the residential happening. This is where that data that we just saw in Chapter 2 is going to come in. It's been applied here to do that evaluation. It's the preliminary data from that study that I just presented. And social vulnerability and housing vulnerability are coming out of the CDC Social Vulnerability Index. And just sparsing those 2 out and saying, okay, you need to incorporate more housing throughout the years because they know they have a deficit in that. But you need to be aware that you have existing vulnerable housing. And so I separated them so that they are more aware that this is something they need to be aware, they need to take care of. And then the social vulnerability, those age groups that we talked about, the economic status. In housing vulnerability, are they isolated? Do they live in crowded areas? Do they have access to vehicles? Are they close enough to the shelters that could potentially serve as structures for them to recuperate from the heat if they needed to? These are people who not necessarily have access to air conditioning, so that needs to be taken into consideration. And finally, transportation, evacuation routes, and also a network analysis developed in ArcGIS to understand where are the comfort shelters that SEMA has in place currently, and are these people in a location that they can get to them easily. Now, the color coding, red means stop. They don't need to do anything about it. Yellow is kind of not really particular pertaining to what they're doing. And any shade of green meant go. So those are areas that they needed to address and tackle. Okay, results. The proposed policies and projects, we ended up having 49 proposals. The biggest proposals came out of transportation and green infrastructure. And this was interesting because these were the 2 people that were extremely verbal in the group, and they constantly use their knowledge of place. They live in the location, they've worked here for a while, and you could see their thought processes occurring as they were doing this. So you had a lot of experiential knowledge, particularly coming out of the transportation member. He was constantly talking through, especially because later on he was in a group where at least one person was not from the location. He kept explaining what he was doing, and you could see he was kind of on fire during the process. The Chatham County green infrastructure person was somebody who knew a lot about the spatial and political aspects of the location. You could see a lot of mentions in the way she was describing what she was trying to do. She's constantly referencing existing plans, existing legislation, regulations, and trying to feed in, and how do we kind of bump this up and include heat into the existing framework that we have. Now, one thing that was very interesting is the difference between the local planners and the others, maybe the outsiders. We had a couple of members who didn't actually, National Weather Service, for example, the Charleston office, which was technically the office that was going to have to be in the room, none of their members could be a part of this workshop. So we had a member from the Atlanta Peachtree office here working, and he really was very open. I'm not aware of it. He did have the stats, he knew it, he had studied about the location, but he wasn't from there. And we had a private consultant who also wasn't from the location and less familiar. The interesting tidbit about this is that these two people in particular, their way of approaching this was what Steinitz calls the defensive strategy. They kind of looked at the evaluation maps and did kind of a broad brush, focused on the where can I work, is there a constraint, and just focused on where they could work. They avoided areas that were less appropriate and just focused on where they needed to address in the maps. The others did took a more offensive strategy, and they really sought to use their knowledge to support what they were addressing, and that is evident in both the things that they were saying, what we were observing about them, and also what they're writing down in the plans. The second part of this is, remember how they said we need a plan, but we also need a communication strategy? So we divided these people in the room into two groups. And we said, okay, group one, I want you to focus on health and communication. Look at this, and how do you come up with a strategy or a plan that's focused on that? In group two, you're the physical group. I want you to focus on the physicality of the space and see what you come up with. And before they even got started, they needed to set up their priorities as a group. So this is what it looks like after they set up the priorities. And you can see there's not a lot of difference. This is going from 0 to 10 right here. They really don't disagree very much. And in fact, they all agree that the top priority is heat. And that's simple. We're doing a heat response planning. It makes sense. But what this tells me is an initial, as I'm looking at their processes, as I'm observing them, is what, again, going back to what Steinitz has observed and others have observed in geodesign, is that they take an anticipatory design approach. And this is very interesting because this is seen in groups where you can see confidence. That means that before when we were talking as a group, something seeped in. They're understanding what's there and how to go about it, and they're also using their experiential knowledge. They're using kind of their case memory on this, and this is something that Christine Heyman talks about, planners kind of have a memory, like a library in their minds, and as they're going through these things, it starts to nudge, it triggers these images of places, locations, and they just start thinking, okay, yes, this makes sense, let's go. And you can see the process just going. There's no stopping, thinking going on. So these findings align, and they make sense because this is common in small design projects, or this is a lot of what we're doing, rapid and initial assessment processes. So what we're seeing is they're confidently using the data that we're seeing. Then we go on to the actual preliminary plans and what they were proposing. And what you can see is wherever the box is the same for like 3 and 3 right here, this means they agreed. They used the same policy or the same project and they agreed on it. And basically consensus was really found in heat and social vulnerability policies between the two groups. There was little to no consensus or agreement in the other systems that we were seeing. And one thing that was very interesting is when you look at the priorities that this group, the communication group, set up for themselves, they didn't see environmental vulnerability as something that was in their wheelhouse. But then when they actually started proposing things, they proposed all 5 of the proposals that were set up. And the reason for that is this is one of those situations where it was somebody from outside drawing those up in the beginning. And a lot of what she's describing in it is we need to communicate. So she's setting up a communication booth in the airport so we can talk to tourists. in the port area so we can communicate to the tourists that they're coming in, they're going to be vulnerable. So the way she addressed it was from a communication standpoint. So by the time they started doing decisions, they started reading the descriptions and what were the objectives, they were like, aha, this is pertinent to what we're doing. So they shifted and put it in, even though initially it wasn't that first reaction. And the opposite happened with the physical group, where it seemed like that was where they were going, and then no, we're not going there. At the end, in the negotiated plan, they pretty much merged their two projects together. The negotiation phase was interesting because they started nitpicking at each other, particularly when the physical group was just trying to say, let's use permeability and heat, and the communication group said, we're not talking about permeability, we're not talking about water, we're talking about heat, get with the program. And they actually made physical changes to the descriptions of certain policies and things like that because they could not understand why the physical group tried to put water into the issue, and that was interesting. I try to say, hey, it's okay, let's move on, but it was like there was reading from the EPA website and they really got contentious about it, and it was funny. But the negotiation phase, the interesting part of it is the merging of it. They all saw the benefits of the two approaches and said, no, we need to merge this. This is interesting. It goes back again to that anticipatory design approach that we talked about in the previous slides. They really showed confidence in the use of what they had, and they as a group, as they were discussing, because there was all these anecdotal stories being told in the back end, those of them who were not from the location felt confident that somebody in the group knew what they were doing. And then they brought in maybe their scientific background, which happened a lot in the communication group where the National Weather Service member was. He kept trying to explain and talk through, what's the mentality, what's going on in National Weather Service. And you could see these dialogues of them, him telling where the science is coming from, and the locals saying, okay, that makes sense. You see this place right here? This is vulnerable. This I've seen here. I park here. I do this. I do that. So they're starting to tell these anecdotal stories and supporting each other. What does that tell me? Well, the conclusion here is that there is a methodological divergence. And it really, and this is part of the barrier. It's not the entire barrier to applying this. But the fact that we were able to open this up a little bit and allow them to contextualize the information, and that's important, enabled this process to occur, the systemic way of seeing the problem and trying to work together to work through this problem and analyze this as an overlay, sort of like what planners would do, individual problems rather than one compiled synthetic problem. Here you go, right? Which is kind of what the planners want, right? They kind of want that. Give me the checkbox. Like, where do I check the boxes? Guideline, procedures, step by step, 1, 2, 3. But in this case, we're saying, okay, no, come here and let's figure this out together so you decide where the guidelines are going to go, where that's going to go. So the combined use of co-production and geodesign gave the insight to the applicability of this type of scientific knowledge of heat vulnerability. And the systemic approach allows the planners to contextualize the information while representing the dynamic aspects of climate. Finally, the fourth chapter focuses on how knowledge is transferred and applied, and how that in turn produces new ways of knowing. The sorts of questions that I'm asking in this chapter is like, what are the processes used by these people to respond to an issue like heat? How do these processes determine that application of science that is produced? And how does this process enable or it limits the use of this knowledge in this decision making at this scale? Whether it's the city or the county scale, how is this different? The conceptual framework starts off with, again, that literature in urban climatology, where we're talking about knowledge gaps and between urban climatologists and city planners in particular. And there's a call from urban climatologists to say, we need to do this. And it's kind of grown more and more and more, and there's several authors, and a lot of it is talking about the lack of accessibility to the knowledge. Are we using the appropriate tools? There might be a lack of a supportive political context. There's resistance from the decision makers in using this, and recognizing that urban climatology is constantly changing itself. So there's always new stuff coming out, and how do you absorb that? So the approach in this chapter is a little different from the other chapters. It's using science and technology studies and to give a more socially and politically engaged approach to think about this production, the circulation, and the application of this urban climate knowledge. And in particular, the STS framework that I'm working on is co-production in again, kind of funneling down, again, an interactional co-production approach, meaning how contemporary political factors reshape or assimilate these knowledge claims that we're making. How does this then get incorporated into the real world, quote unquote? And I'm using two concepts out of this whole bunch of stuff that's coming out of it. Well, I'm not using two concepts, but I'm adhering to two concepts. Sheila Jasanoff talks about something called ordering instruments. They're things that planners, practitioners use to do the things that they need to do to support the creation of institutions, to create policies, to represent things, to create a regulatory framework. Particularly, the institutions serve at what is called inscription devices of society, which that means that they're the repositories of knowledge. They're the ones that they have the power to decide if this is a thing, and if it is, how does it get applied? What are the routines that we're going to establish after this? And the social technical imaginaries, which is something that Jasanoff with Kim developed later on, which is this idea that practitioners need to create a collective vision for the future. And this is very true for what we see in the planning area. Practitioners inspire themselves by this idea, where are we going to be in 2030? This is true here. You look at the comprehensive plan. What's this image? That whole talk about our elderly population is going to increase by 70.6%. Why does this matter? Well, because Chapman County sees itself becoming a retirement community by 2030. It is seeing itself attracting more of that population in, and it's saying, yes, we're going to be an aging county. We're going to be supportive to this new kind of view of what we're becoming. So this is important in this context, and this is where the social technical imaginaries are coming in. So what is the findings? The first finding that we find kind of aligns with the past chapter. It's this need to contextualize and visualize what is going on. The use of experiential knowledge to identify and visualize issues. And like I mentioned in the previous chapter, you see people talking about these things. They're using their knowledge. When they see this green area saying, go act on that, they look into it and they start thinking, where is this? And they start telling each other these anecdotal stories about how they know a place in that location. This makes sense. They start referring back to what they know. And that goes again back to what I mentioned, Christian Heyman talking about the use of experiential knowledge by planners, designers, as sort of their case memory. They need to relate to the information so that they can make a decision about it. And so this is what's going on. More importantly, it's about recognizing the problem. Heat as a legitimate stressor. Heat is a thing. So making it visual so that people can see it, institutions can see it, legislators can see it. So this is a thing, people be aware of it. And so it comes out to like create future land use map for resiliency component specifically for heat. Let's talk about heat, let's include this, let's make it a thing. And future land use map. That social technical imaginary coming in and saying, we have a collective vision, this plays a role in what our future looks like and what it could be. And so we need to incorporate this so that we're aware of it, and now we're going to make our county less vulnerable and safer for that vulnerable community that might be coming in. This aligns with things talked about by Coburn and Webb, who are two authors who have worked in similar lines that I'm trying to work on here. They use co-production to try and understand the application of urban climatology. And they talk about contextualization and visualization as something to stabilize and institutionalize knowledge. And it's the same thing that I'm seeing. This needs to become a thing, and it needs to be part of that institutional routine. The institution needs to buy into it, embrace it, and then it becomes assimilated. It becomes incorporated. The second finding is the use of knowledge as a fail-safe versus a safe-to-fail approach. Now this goes into the training of the planner itself. Thomas Campanella says something that has stuck to me for a while. The planner is a jack of all trades, a master of none, meaning the planners are trained to be generalists. Even though they act like they're experts, what they're taught and trained to do is to go out, seek the information that supports and justifies how to act. And at the core of that is the need to make data and action unquestionable. So here's the problem. When we're talking about urban climatology, when we're talking about climate, there are nuances, there are uncertainties. But when uncertainty is present, justifying action becomes muddled. So there's a problem here. I'll tell you a little anecdotal story about what happened here. The National Weather Service is well aware that the heat index values are acquired in shady, light wind conditions. So in an urbanized area, no tree covers, what we're actually going to see is that the heat index values are going to be about 15 Fahrenheit higher than they're seeing. And I'm not saying that, that's on their website. And this came up when Steve Nelson from the National Weather Service is in the room and we started those conversations. He kept bringing this up again and again, and he's saying people die at conditions lower than when we're setting up advisories, when we're setting up warnings. You need to be aware of this because in your frameworks right now, SEMA will only start shelters if you're within that advisory warning setup, and this is a problem. Well, about 15 minutes later, somebody from SEMA goes and says, I need to make a note that Charleston's office actually uses 5 Fahrenheit higher to emit advisories and warnings. And he cautions her and says, talk to your local office before you make a regulatory change. But what she was doing, she's saying, I can't take your word for it. I can't cite this website in my regulation. I need to be aware that my local office, when my local office is going to issue that advisory, that warning, and I need to refer to whatever that regulation or whatever that institution is doing. So she's kind of stuck in this process. She recognized what he was saying. She just couldn't act on it. So it's a process of legitimization of action that seeks fail-safe approaches. So it's a policy renders data unquestionable. And when nuance and uncertainty occur, there's a possibility of failure. So how do we act on this? When there's this kind of thought process of, I can't fail, I can't fail, I can't fail, there's liability, somebody's going to sue me, I need to kind of stitch everything together so this makes me safe. And it goes back to the use of stabilized, institutionalized knowledge. It's all kind of, I need to refer to something that's been done, it's regulated, and it's set up so I don't fail in this. And there's several locations where I see quotes and observed actions like this, and not just that National Weather Service situation. The third and final finding from this comes out of specific policies leading to specific actions. So policies are needed to support targeted actions. Once we've established this is a thing, it happens, we know it, we've seen it, we've contextualized it, now we need to figure out how we're going to target this, how we're going to prioritize this, what are the performance standards, what are the guidelines, how are people going to act? And it goes back to that planner's way of thinking, step by step, give me the check boxes, and telling everybody now you all act the same way, and sort of generalizing the form of action. And so to be actionable, knowledge needs to support the incentives and establish codes of action. It needs to be part of an established routine. There's guidelines, there's performance standards, there are incentives, there's ways of making planners follow suit, understand this is a thing, and act upon it. So it's a justifying of action so that it ensures that that envisioned future that we were talking about happens. So this all aligns with how does this bring from where we are to where we're seeing ourselves going as a community. And it's talking to the public. It is really thinking about how does this impact the end user and trying to make this into about the community. And it is sort of the source of inspiration for the planners in the room based on my observations. So this chapter shows that decision makers do not readily recognize the scientific knowledge that is produced until it is stabilized and institutionalized, until it becomes a source that their institution kind of embraced and supports that application. So to be usable, the information needs to be, one, contextualized and visualized. It needs to be incorporated into routines, and it needs to be linked to that collective vision for the future. It needs to support that. But the discussion is then, how do we shift towards a safe-fail mentality? How do we need to embrace and understand these trade-offs. And this comes through something that's come out of environmental management and the contingency interventions approach, where decision makers and sort of the institutional framework is open for revision. And it's in those moments where new information can be incorporated. If we're open to saying this is a shifting process, it's a thing, all right, but it's going to change, and we know it's going to change, and new knowledge is coming along, then it enables, it sort of stabilizes the process of understanding change versus trying to incorporate change, and it just, is it certain enough that we can incorporate it? All right, so here's what you looked at. We looked at an integrative approach to examine barriers to the transference of knowledge between urban climatologists and land use planners. The core of this is heat and heat vulnerability. Co-production is used throughout this process, both to set the theme for the research. Understand, is heat something that this community is worried about, that these decision makers are interested in? And identify the types of data needed in the decision-making process, which we analyzed and looked at in Chapter 2. The use of co-production in geodesign as a form of fostering application, of thinking through different ways, different perspectives of looking at this data and thinking and collaboratively making decision-making, which is what we saw in Chapter 3. And finally, the interactional co-production approach seen out of STS, thinking through the thought process, looking at the thought processes that determine the use and applicability of data that we're seeing in Chapter 4. The overall conclusions is that the plans need to be cautious and explore ways of maintaining urban greening within the city. This is coming out of Chapter 2, but it aligns with studies like Neil Debbage and Dr. Shepard have seen before. This need to incorporate the green infrastructure within this network, and we need to understand that tree canopy cover has a great impact in the way these land surface temperatures change. Pathway to applying urban climatology knowledge relies on the interaction between scientists and practitioners. This collaboration needs to occur, and it needs to be more cognizant of the ways data is processed and thought through so that it is usable and applied. We need to embrace trade-offs. In other words, I don't think we need to do a better job communicating the losses will inevitably occur, but the regulatory system needs to embrace it, that these losses will occur, and that these things need to be incorporated and be explained through the regulatory framework. There's this win-win kind of vision and this fear of saying, there might not be a future, and how do we say this to the community? And we can be doomsday like that sometimes as scientists. And it's understandable these communities do not want to necessarily think about these things. But they need to find ways to think about it. And they're doing it in other instances like sea level rise. where they're thinking through what might be and trying to see how to act, whether it's conservatively or not. And embrace knowledge transference as an iterative process. This is a cycle. It is not an one-end sort of thing. This is not a loading dock. I do not produce data, leave it here, and say, hey, use it. It's not like that. To make it usable, it is going to take getting down and working together and coming back, understanding the experiential knowledge and feeding that back into the production of knowledge. It is a cycle. It is not a one-way road. Thank you very, very much for all of you that came here. Thank you to my co-advisors, my committee. You've been amazing. Thank you for your support. Thank you to my friends who are here today to support me and who have, God damn it, you guys are great. And for my funding and all the support that I got from my collaborators. Sergio Bernardes is not here, but he is amazing as well. And all the work that he did through CGR with me for the 2 first chapters was great. So with that said, I'll take any questions if you have any.
So at this point in the defense, we open it up for the guests in the room before we close it to the private committee session. So pretty much anyone around the perimeter of the room.
Hey, Andrew.
Has it been considered of evaluating different parts of the city to see which are most able to hold, which would be least, how to say it, be better for the more vulnerable people, and then telling the public or the people who are moving into those places that these places may be more vulnerable or maybe more or less vulnerable than these other places, and giving knowledge to the people who might want to move into and live in these areas?
That's a hard one. So here's the first thing is, part of the problem with working with the data sets that we're working, for example, is like if you look at the national land cover data set that we're looking at right now, all that tree covered area that I was very interested in having incorporated, and that's why I parsed it out in the 3rd chapter for Savannah, right? That does not show in that land covered data set. That area, even though it has tree canopy cover incorporated in it, it does not show in that data set. So we have an issue still with the data that's available. And frankly, there's ways where I could do that. We could do simulations, we could show that in much more detail. But then that kind of pitfalls my whole approach of using readily available data for them to just use and to replicate it into like the whole coastal commission, the regional commission. The other part of what you're asking is, I don't know that the local decision makers are actually interested in opening that Pandora's box. What does that mean when you start communicating to people that, look, this location is vulnerable? You're telling people don't move there. Rather than saying, we understand that this is vulnerable and we're going to work on it and we're going to work with you.
I guess my thought is to say different parts of the city rather than say the entire location.
Yeah, I think that we need to empower local neighborhoods and local communities for them to understand that they are vulnerable. And Savannah does have a pretty good group of nonprofits that I think could benefit from this understanding, and this might push a more grassroots approach to it. What is not said in this dissertation, for example, is how over half of my collaborators have actually left their posts. And it is because they're tired of trying to being the trailblazers and trying to work in sustainability in a location where climate is such a politically charged topic. And they're not moving to the south. The 3 main players, the planners that worked with me, one has moved to Seattle, and the other one has moved to New York. And the 3rd one decided she's going to just raise her kids. She's getting just too stressed. So these are the 3 planners. We had more people, but this is an important context to deal with as well. that it's difficult. So I think that if we did give nonprofits an opportunity to understand their levels of vulnerability, it would help to create kind of a bottom-up approach. But I don't know that I don't think that the local city wants, the local planners want to open that box and say, hey, by the way, you're living in a vulnerable location. That's not going to pan out well. Yes.
Could you please go to your 15th slide?
Okay. I thought I was only going to get questions like that from my committee members, but yeah, sure.
15.
Let me. This one, okay. Yeah.
Yeah. In this slide, I have a simple question about the time series analysis. You have three images from 1992, 2001, and 2011. So according to this figure, I only see the results from 1992 to 2011. So I just wonder if some situation happens. For example, in some places there was a forest and it changes to the residential land and go back to a forest. Is that situation happens or impact your final results? Because you only show me like the only two results from 2 time periods, but you use 3 time periods.
Yeah, there's 3 time periods, a total of almost 300 images to develop this. But I'm only showing this because 2001 is kind of an intermediary between this. It's just an intensification of what we're seeing from 1992 to 2011. And there were no scenarios that I remember that went from tree covered to urban to back to tree covered. That wasn't apparent in any of the situations. It was what I did see is it went from tree cover to residential low impact, and then it intensified. And this is here, this intensification process. So what you're seeing, and this is a trend nationally, where we're pushing for densification. So if you started to urbanize, let's urbanize where it is. Let's push for infill. Let's try and fill up the land that's already become impervious. Which is another interesting thing to talk about, because what we're seeing is this is also not necessarily a great thing for the land surfaces. But I didn't see any retroceding and coming back. That really didn't happen. And you can see that. You don't see green going pink in any case. So
Other questions?
I think John here in the back.
Oh, yes.
Well, it can be quick. I just really liked when you were showing the maps and like in the workshop situation where you're kind of disentangling all these different parts of vulnerability and this landscape rather than doing a single index which just kind of simplifies. But then I was just wondering how that conversation went, because one nice thing about an index is that it shows you these are the places, whereas when you have all these different maps, like, well, where do you actually focus? Because it might be confusing to kind of deal with all these different images. So I was just wondering how you dealt with that in the workshop and how people kind of talked through that.
So the beginning of the workshop actually was kind of getting everybody on the same page process. So we had everybody kind of talked a little bit, or National Weather Service, myself, and SEMA, we talked extensively, but then we opened up and we had like kind of a discussion about what we were talking about, where that data was presented to them. So they had kind of the broader understanding of how this data is being produced, where is this coming from, what is the actual index, what are the locations that we see as combined being vulnerable, and then we dispersed the 8 systems. So it was I tried to the best of my ability to have them understand kind of the backbone of how everything's what we're putting forward to them and why this might be pertinent to them, because they were interested, they already wanted this to become a thing. It's easier, right? But we try to explain to them, like, how does this data come about? Where is this coming from? What's the general aspects? And now we're opening this up and saying, now you get to dive into it a little bit more. So that was the approach that I used. And I also had the local, so I wish that Charlotte office had come rather than Peachtree, though Steve is amazing. Charleston, sorry. Had come, because it would have given them a point of contact, because part of my objective also was to get them to know each other a little bit more and establish these contacts. But I think Steve did a great job in saying, I am not the person, but I do detain the information, and here are the people. And he put all the contacts up, and he said, if you feel like you like me better, come contact me. I'll put you in contact with him. He's a really nice, approachable guy. So I think in that sense it helped. And I had SEMA, the Chattanooga Emergency Management agent, and him be the first people. Because maybe that's not the case, but in my mind, I'm an outsider. And so I needed them to I wanted them to establish a network in themselves, create trust in the other people that are also producing data information. And hopefully that worked.
All right. I think unless there are any other questions, we'll go ahead and shut it down so we can get to the next fun part, which is the closed meeting. So thank you all for coming.